The first thing the old men tell you, if you can get them to talk at all, is that the mountains remember everything. The trees forget nothing, the soil forgets nothing, and the names carved into unmarked stones have a way of rising back to the surface, no matter how many generations try to bury them. And in the quiet folds of the southern Appalachians, where mist clings to the ridgelines like a shroud, there is one family the mountains refuse to let rest. A family born into madness, raised in isolation, and bound together by a silence so complete that when the world finally heard their story, it felt like a scream breaking through a century of darkness. Most people have never seen the valley where the Ridgeton family lived. It's not on maps, not anymore. The old trail collapsed decades ago, and the last cabin rotted into the earth long before the state sent surveyors to confirm it even existed. But if you follow the ash trees down the ravine, there's a coldness in the air that doesn't belong to the season. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear the faint echo of a life twisted by fear, superstition, and the kind of isolation that turns human minds inward until they start feeding on themselves. The Ridgetons weren't always a rumor. Once they were flesh and blood, a small clan scattered across a patch of hillside no one else wanted. When the railroad companies swept through the region, most families sold their land or fled, but the Ridgetons stayed. They stayed because they believed the world outside their valley was poisoned. Poisoned by sin, poisoned by outsiders, poisoned by the very idea of change. Down in the towns below, people whispered that they had turned inward, that they married only among themselves, that the family line began folding like paper, weaker and more fragile each generation. But whispers are easy. Truth is harder, and the truth, when it finally seeped out, was worse than anyone expected. The strange thing is how little there is on record. The county archives for those years are thin, almost deliberately so. A few birth certificates with misspelled names, a handful of arrest logs for the patriarchs, and one coroner's report so disturbing that the sheriff at the time ordered it locked away. But stories survive where documents fail, and every person who encountered the Ridgetons, every doctor, every sheriff's deputy, every missionary who tried to reach the valley, came away changed, shaken, as if they'd glimpsed a part of American history the rest of us were never meant to see. They say the first sign that something was wrong in the Ridgeton Valley wasn't the silence, but the sound that broke it. A low, wavering wail that neighbors described as neither human nor animal, drifting down the ridge on winter nights. People in the town would stop what they were doing, mid-step, mid-sentence, and just listen. The mountains carried the noise like a warning, and though no one could prove it came from the Ridgeton homestead, everyone assumed it did, because by then, the family's reputation had already curdled into something murky and unnatural. The earliest accounts come from traveling ministers who pushed deeper into the mountains during the 1890s. Most didn't return. The few who did brought back stories of children with sunken eyes, pale as creek stones, staring from behind the trees. One preacher described a boy no older than 8, standing perfectly still, as if carved from bone, watching the men from a distance without blinking once. When the preacher called out to him, the boy simply turned and walked into the brush, vanishing like he'd never been there at all. Locals said the Ridgetons feared outsiders so intensely that the sight of a stranger would scatter them like crows. But the truth was more complicated. Fear was part of it, yes. But fear alone doesn't explain the way the family seemed to know when someone was approaching, long before they could have seen or heard them. Hunters complained of being observed by eyes they couldn't find. Surveyors reported children appearing behind them without a sound, barefoot in the dead of winter, their faces blank and unreadable. The mountains are full of stories, but these felt like something older, something shaped by isolation so profound it reshaped the human spirit itself. When the county nurse Lydia Burrow made her first trek to the homestead in 1907, she brought medical supplies, blankets, and a notebook. She returned with half of her supplies missing, her notebook empty, and a look on her face that no one forgot. She refused to speak about what she'd seen, not that day, not ever again. But years later, her daughter found a single line written on the inside cover of that blank notebook, almost carved into the paper. There are families that grow, and there are families that fold in on themselves. The Ridgetons are the latter. Stranger still was what she wrote beneath it, in handwriting that shook so badly the letters slanted into one another, and something in that valley wants them to stay that way. What people didn't understand, what they still don't understand, is that the madness in the Ridgeton bloodline didn't erupt all at once. It seeped in slowly like water through rotting wood, creeping from generation to generation until the whole structure collapsed under the weight of secrets no family could bear. But even secrets leave traces, and the first real trace appeared in the winter of 1914, when a storm tore through the valley and forced the oldest son, Clay Ridgeton, to seek help in town. Clay was 23, though he looked closer to 40. His hair hung in clumps around his face, and his eyes. People would talk about those eyes for years. Not because they were cold or cruel, but because they were empty. Like every emotion had been scraped out of him with a dull blade. He arrived barefoot, wearing a coat so threadbare it seemed more symbolic than practical. Over his shoulder he carried his younger sister May, who was feverish and twisting in his arms, mumbling words no one could decipher. When the town doctor examined her, he found bruises shaped like fingers around her wrists, a deep gash along her ribs, and signs of long-term malnourishment. But when he asked Clay what happened, the young man didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't even look at the doctor. He just said one thing in a voice so flat it barely registered as human. The mountain took her. That phrase became legend. The mountain took her. Clay repeated it to the sheriff, to the nurse, to anyone who questioned him, and each time, he gave no elaboration, no emotion, no sign he understood how strange it sounded. It was as though he were repeating something he'd been taught, something drilled into him since childhood. Rumors spread fast. Some said the family believed a spirit lived deep in the ravine, feeding off illness, taking a Ridgeton child every few years as payment for something their ancestors had done. Others whispered the truth was far simpler and far darker. That Clay and the other men in the family weren't protecting their siblings from the mountain, they were protecting the mountain from outsiders. That whatever happened in that valley, whatever rituals, punishments, or delusions the Ridgetons lived under were designed to keep the bloodline closed, sealed tight, festering. When May finally woke, her fever broken, she said something that froze every person in the room. She looked past her brother, past the doc, past the oil lamp flickering on the wall, and whispered, "It watches us when we sleep." She didn't specify who or what she meant. Clay refused to bring her back up the mountain, and that was the first crack in the Ridgeton lineage, the moment one of them stepped outside the valley and didn't return. It wouldn't be the last. Clay's refusal to return May to the homestead wasn't just a fracture. It was a declaration, and in families like the Ridgetons, declarations have consequences. Within days, men from the valley appeared at the edge of town. No one saw them arrive. They were simply there at dawn, standing in the frost like statues, staring at the doctor's office where May recovered. They didn't speak. They didn't threaten. They just waited, their clothes ragged, their faces gaunt, their eyes reflecting nothing but a cold, ancestral obedience to a tradition the outside world had forgotten. The sheriff, Tom Harker, tried to confront them. He was a large man, unafraid of trouble, but something in the way those silent figures held themselves unsettled him. They didn't react when he raised his voice. They didn't flinch when he rested his hand on his revolver. When he demanded they leave, the eldest of the group simply tilted his head, as if trying to understand the sound of the sheriff's words. And then, without warning, they turned and walked back toward the tree line with a fluid, unnatural synchronicity, disappearing into the woods like shadows slipping beneath a door. That night, May began to scream in her sleep. The nurse found her thrashing on the cot, eyes rolled back, fingernails scraping deep grooves into the wooden frame. When she finally calmed, she clutched the nurse's wrist and whispered something so softly it was nearly lost in her breath. "You can hear them if you listen, they don't walk alone." The townspeople didn't want to believe her. But strange things began happening after the men's visit. Livestock went missing from barns without any footprints in the snow. Doors that had been locked were found open at dawn. Children woke crying, claiming they had seen pale faces at the windows watching. And always, facing the same direction toward the Ridgeton Valley. Sheriff Harker organized a search party against the advice of nearly everyone in town. 12 men volunteered, but only 8 were willing to cross the ridge. By the time they reached the valley's edge, the temperature had dropped unnaturally. Not seasonally cold, wrong cold. A stillness hung in the air so absolute that even their breaths sounded intrusive. And on the trail, they found something that should not have been there. A circle of stones, each carved with symbols none of the men recognized, arranged with meticulous precision. In the center, a woven bundle of twigs wrapped with strands of hair, unmistakable, human hair. Sheriff Harker looked at it for a long time, then ordered his men to turn back immediately. Not because he feared the Ridgetons, but because, for the first time in his career, he felt the land itself watching him. What the sheriff and his men didn't know, what no one outside that valley could have understood, was that the Ridgeton family had lived under a system older than the cabins they built, older than the soil they planted, older even than the family name itself. It was a system held together by fear, ritual, and a belief passed from parent to child like a curse the world beyond the ridge was not meant for them. And the deeper Sheriff Harker dug, the more he realized that the valley wasn't just isolating the family, it was containing them. In the weeks after the failed search, Clay began speaking more freely, not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. He would sit by the corner of the doctor's office, elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards as though they held memories he didn't want to witness. And slowly, between fits of sleeplessness, he explained what life in the valley had become, how the patriarch, Elias Ridgeton, ruled the family with a doctrine he claimed came from the mountain itself, how no one was allowed to leave after dark, how children were punished for speaking to outsiders, even travelers who merely passed along the ridge, how every newborn child was blessed with a ritual Clay said he barely remembered, except for one detail. Elias always performed it alone, and afterward, the infant would not stop crying for hours. When asked why the ritual was necessary, Clay's face tightened. He said Elias believed the world was filled with hungry things, spirits wandering the forest who could slip into a child before it learned its own name, and each ritual was meant to keep those spirits out. But if that were true, then why were so many of the Ridgeton children born sick? Why did they speak in whispers even when alone? Why did they flinch at sunlight as though it were an unfamiliar touch? The doctor pressed him for answers, but Clay only repeated what he'd been taught. If the bloodline breaks, the valley breaks with it. He said Elias feared something a previous generation had done. An offense, a betrayal, a forgotten sin carved into the family's history like rot buried inside a tree. And whatever that sin was, Clay believed the family had been paying for it ever since. What disturbed the sheriff most was not the content of the story, but Clay's delivery. He spoke with no emotion, no fear, no regret, as though he were reciting a memory that never fully belonged to him, a memory inherited rather than lived. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Clay's story should have been the turning point. The moment the town rallied, the moment someone intervened before the valley swallowed the last of the Ridgetons whole. But fear has a way of paralyzing even the strongest communities. And in the months that followed, the town fell into a strange, uneasy quiet. People closed their doors earlier. Lights went out before dusk. Even the bravest men avoided the ridge. It was as though the valley had stretched its shadow outward, settling over the town like a second winter. And then, one night, the silence broke. It was May who heard it first, a soft tapping at the window beside her bed. Not loud, not frantic, just persistent, like a child's finger gently testing the glass. The nurse rushed in and pulled back the curtain, expecting a branch, an animal, anything that made sense. Instead, she found a bundle of dried twigs tied with a strip of cloth. When she lifted it, the entire bundle unraveled in her hand. Inside was a single strip of bark with 4 words carved into it, each letter cut deep and shaking, "Bring her home now." Sheriff Harker doubled security around the doctor's office. But he knew, the whole town knew, that the valley wouldn't stop asking. 2 nights later, the tapping returned, this time louder. May sat upright, her breath shaking, her eyes huge and unblinking. "It's not them," she whispered. "It's not my brothers." When the sheriff asked who she meant, she pointed toward the window, her hand trembling like a leaf in storm wind. "The thing they hear. The one they think protects them." The sheriff didn't believe in mountain spirits, but even he couldn't explain what happened next. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly the oil lamp flickered out. Frost crept across the window from the outside, though the night was warm, and from the other side of the glass came a sound no human throat could make. A low, drawn-out groan, a sound like wood bending under enormous weight. The sheriff lifted his lantern and stepped outside, revolver drawn. In the dirt below the window, he found no footprints, no disturbed soil, but the grass had been pressed flat in a perfect semicircle, as if something heavy had been crouched there watching. May refused to sleep after that. She told the nurse the family had never been alone in the valley, that Elias spoke to something in the forest, something the children heard but were forbidden to name, something that promised safety in exchange for obedience. And the mistake, she said, wasn't that Clay left. The mistake was that he took her with him. The final breaking point came not from the valley, nor from Elias, nor from the rituals whispered through generations, but from Clay himself. Because once a person steps outside the world that shaped them, even for a moment, something begins to change. A kind of clarity seeps in, a kind of reckoning, and for the first time in his life, Clay began to fear not the mountain, but the truth buried inside it. The night everything came undone began with a voice May recognized instantly. A man's voice, low and wavering, calling her name from the tree line behind the doctor's home. She froze, the sheriff froze, even the wind seemed to stop. Clay was sitting on the steps outside, head in his hands, and when he heard that voice, every muscle in his body went rigid. because the voice didn't belong to any living Ridgeton. It belonged to their brother Jacob, dead for 3 years. May whispered, "He's trying to sound like him." And Clay whispered back, "He always tries." The sheriff blew out the lantern to avoid drawing attention. But darkness didn't bring safety. It only made the sound clearer. Soft footsteps in the leaves. A long, uneven drag. Then another voice, their mother's this time, calling from deeper in the trees. But the tone was wrong, too measured, too hollow, as though someone were wearing her voice like a coat. May grabbed Clay's sleeve. "It learned us," she said. "All those nights listening." Clay stood up slowly, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the forest where no shapes moved. Only the sound creeping closer, calling, calling, calling. And then he said something that chilled the sheriff to the bone. "It doesn't want her. It wants us. All of us, together." He stepped forward, and the sheriff had to hold him back. Clay shook violently, torn between two worlds. The one he'd escaped and the one that had built him, and behind them, in the brush, something exhaled, long, low, and hungry. That was when May screamed, not out of fear but realization. "It can't cross the ridge," she cried. "That's why it needs them to take us back. It never leaves the valley. It uses them to bring us home." The sheriff fired his revolver into the darkness. Not because he saw a threat, but because he felt one. The forest fell silent, no footsteps, no voices, no breathing. But the next morning, when the townspeople gathered, they found a trail of handprints pressed into the dirt along the ridge path, deep, misshapen, as though whatever made them had too many joints or not enough. Clay left that same day, carrying May toward the train station at dawn. The sheriff tried to stop him, but Clay only said one thing before he disappeared down the road. "If we stay, it'll come for all of you. If we go back, it'll take us one by one. But if we leave, maybe it dies with the valley." No one ever saw either of them again. And as for the Ridgeton homestead, years later, when surveyors finally reached the valley, they found no cabins, no tools, no bones. Just an empty clearing, cold as a cellar, as if the land itself had swallowed every trace of the bloodline it had held captive for over a century. The last chapter of the Ridgeton story isn't written in any archive, any newspaper clipping, or any sheriff's log. It lives in shadows, in the way old-timers lower their voices when the valley is mentioned, in the way hunters refuse to cross that ridge even decades later, in the way the air around that patch of mountains still feels colder than it should. Because stories don't always end when the people in them disappear. Sometimes the land holds on, sometimes the fear outlives the bloodline. Years after Clay and May vanished, the state tried to reclaim the valley for development. Roads were mapped, funding approved, and crews were sent to scout the terrain. But every attempt to cross the ridge ended the same way. Equipment failures, accidents, inexplicable injuries. Men who had spent their whole lives in the mountains returned shaken, claiming their compasses spun in circles near the valley's mouth, claiming they heard whispers in the brush though no wind was blowing. A foreman, a veteran of 3 decades, emerged pale and trembling, unable to explain why he refused to set foot past a particular ash tree. "Something's wrong there," he said. "Something's waiting." Eventually, the state abandoned the project. On paper, the decision was blamed on stability of terrain. Off the record, everyone knew better. The strangest part came later, when an archivist covering the old county files found something odd buried in a folder mislabeled and nearly forgotten. A death ledger from the early 1900s, one that should have listed the Ridgeton family by name. But the names were scribbled out, every one of them, as though someone tried to erase the bloodline completely from history. Only one line was left untouched, written in a different hand than the rest. They did not die. They returned, and no one could trace the handwriting. No one could confirm which official logged it. But the archivist swore the ink looked fresher than it had any right to be. Today, hikers sometimes report strange sounds near the ridge. Not screams, not voices, just a rhythmic tapping, like knuckles against wood. Others claim they've seen figures between the trees, still and pale, almost blending into the bark. When they call out, the figures vanish, leaving behind only silence, a heavy, watchful silence. And sometimes, very rarely, someone finds a bundle of twigs tied with a strip of cloth left neatly beside the trail. Inside there's nothing, or almost nothing, just the faintest imprint of a hand, small, child-sized. Some say the Ridgeton curse died with the valley. Others say curses don't die. They wait, they listen, they follow the blood, and somewhere far beyond those mountains, a brother and sister are still walking, never stopping, never looking back, carrying with them a secret the land itself tried to keep. Because some families are born into pain, some are born into silence, and some are born into madness.